This is Garis, Masculist, MGTOW, Flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW. Written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 698, part 2, entitled To Fluffies and Feminists, Learn Some Masculism or Be Manless. Continuing straight on. Masculists push hard for the fipping of women, putting tremendous moral pressure on young women to get off their fat parasitic asses and fit up, to become fips as adults and not manslave and divorce rape men. Masculists see that living in a fip society will allow the divorce courts to be based on the principle of financial independence of both divorcing parties, the father and the mother. With all the mothers being fips, they can afford to not be fluffies to their ex-husbands. Custody of the kids can be made joint by default, as is already the case in a quarter of states in the US and in several other countries. Alimony can be thrown out, as well as the halving of wealth and stuff. The creation of a FIP society will free men from the worst of all gender crimes in either direction, that is from man to woman or woman to man, and that is man's slavery, which the Masculists see as literally 1,000 times bigger problem than was Negro slavery in the US in the early 1800s, when there were several million Negro slaves in the US, and there are several billion man slaves in the world today. Masculists have a hatred of man's slavery and aim to wipe it out by wiping out the fluffies, forcing them to fip up or rot on the shelf, dying slow, miserable deaths, joining the third of middle-aged women today who live alone with their cats and take antidepressant drugs. Another major gender crime so hated by the Masculists that women commit against men in large numbers is forced fathering. Women have the MARA, that's maternity rejection right, aka abortion right, so that women have the legislated right to reject an unwanted pregnancy that could ruin her life. But men don't have the PARA, paternity rejection right, so women in their millions routinely force men to be fathers, paying for a kid he never wanted in the first place for 2 decades of his life, thus manslaving him for 2 decades. Millions of women pill lie, telling their man that she's taking the pill, but isn't, gets pregnant, then by law, in capital letters, forces him to pay for the kid. An even worse form of forced paternity is women's paternity fraud, where the woman claims that the kid growing in her is her man's, but in reality she knows that it is some other man's. This utterly callous gender crime against men is so horrible that Masculists are pushing for such paternity fraudster women to be given a 15-year jail sentence compared to a 10-year jail sentence for a rapist, since Masculists see paternity fraud as a worse, more horrible gender crime than rape. The PARA will take the form of a government form that an undesiring father can fill in, stating that he does not want the kid. If the mother then refuses to abort, she takes full financial responsibility for the costs of the kid. If she's a FIP, she can afford it, which is one of the many reasons why the Masculists consider it so important that we create a FIP society, why Masculists place such heavy moral pressure on women to FIP up and not man-slave men. To see the PARA legislated, as well as the OPTAB, O-P-T-A-B, that's obligatory paternity testing at birth, to block women's paternity fraud, close brackets, it will be necessary to establish GECs, G-E-Cs, Gender Equality Committees, in the parliaments that consist half of female feminist politicians and half of male masculist politicians, so that the gender issues of both sexes are treated equally, in capital letters, those two emphasized words, which is far from being the case today in today's gynocentric society in terms of gender political awareness and political action. These gecs will then mend fair the gender laws, create a FIP society, reform the divorce courts, legislate the para and optab, etc. The creation of the gecs is one of the primary political goals of the masculists and is seen as an essential means for the liberation of men, millions, later billions of men, from the awful ways that women oppress men with their manslavery, their divorce rape, their forced fathering, etc. The big issue for the masculists is, quote, in the form of a question, how to create these gecs and then to mend fair the gender laws, question mark. With today's level of monoconsciousness and ignorance of masculist ideas, how to get society to agree with the creation of the gecs, question mark. The monoconscious feminists, in all their callousness towards males, will fight its creation. Since if the gecs mend fair the gender laws, then women will be forced to be FIPs. Women will lose their fluffy privileges in the divorce courts. Forced fathering women will be sent to jail, etc. Monoconscious feminazis will fight the creation of the gecs, the para, the optab, etc., tooth and nail. And since the politicians today are nearly as exclusively monoconscious as are feminists, they will continue to legislate in favour of what women want. That is what the feminists want. Since these politicians are very conscious of the power of the bloc female vote. So, and this is now the and this is now the heart of this flyer. What can men, masculists, do to make society a lot more bi-conscious, so that the zeitgeist becomes bi-conscious, thus making the men fairing of society easier, question mark. Masculists need a strategy that will be very effective in converting monoconscious feminists into bi-conscious feminists. That is, motivating monoconscious feminists into learning some masculism so that they become bi-conscious and hence lose their monoconscious anger at men, as taught them by feminism, for the ways that men oppress women, by having this anger cancelled by their female masculist anger at women for the ways that women oppress men, and in fact worse than vice versa. So masculist strategists need to ask themselves, quote, what is the most powerful way to push women, especially monoconscious feminists, to become bi-conscious, that is, to learn some masculism? Question mark. What is the greatest fear of most women? I think the answer is to not get a man, hence not to have a baby, not to have companionship, love and sex. Men have the power to deprive women of these things, as shown by the fact that in the US today, 2/3 of young men don't even date young women. So masculists can preach to young women that if they don't bother to learn some masculism and hence become bi-conscious and hence much nicer for men to be with, then they will be severely punished by not having a man. As most men become masculisted, most men will not tolerate fluffies and monoconscious feminists, punishing them so severely that these women are effectively exterminated, in the sense that they are forced to rot on the shelf, utterly rejected by men, masculisted and MGTOWed men. As masculist and MGTOW ideas spread across the planet, we will see millions of confrontations between monoconscious feminists and bi-conscious masculists, especially on campuses, where most social revolutions start, and then spread to the journalists, and then to the masses. We men, masculisted and MGTOWed men, have the power to force young women to be manless, and we are doing just that with the dating strike by young men in the US today. Millions of young men need to tell young women that if they don't FIP up and learn some masculism to become biconscious, then they will be severely punished by not getting a man. As millions of young women wake up to the reality that they truly are not going to get a man, as millions of young men refuse to date young women, then there'll be a mass panic as young women realize that men have the power to make these women's young lives a misery. We are already seeing hundreds of TikToks on the internet showing young women in their 20s and 30s in tears as they bitterly lament that no man wants them. The next step is for young men to preach masculinist ideas to these young women, millions of them, so that these young women realize that if they want to have a man in their lives, then they had better stop being monoconscious, feminazi, bitchy, being told by biconscious masculisted men that, quote, men don't want relationships with misandrous, male-dumping, feminazi cunts, who then reject them viciously, forcing such women to rot on the shelf. When most men have been masculisted, this general biconsciousing and fipping of women can occur on a massive scale, with millions of young women converting themselves into biconscious feminists, making them much nicer for men to be with. The masculists will then push these biconscious, feministed women to vote, in capital letters, with men for the men-fairing of the gender laws, especially for the reform of the divorce courts, basing them on the principle of financial independence, which will require the creation of a FIP society. So society needs to be heavily biconscious by spreading masculist ideas to the point that everyone is as well informed of masculist ideas as they are today of feminist ideas. Thus the masculists need to undertake a massive education campaign, teaching society that gender oppression is a two-way street, that women oppress men worse, far worse, with their many horrible, decades-lasting gender crimes against men, in brackets, for example, the big three of women's manslavery, women's divorce rape, women's forced fathering, close brackets. Once society is strongly biconscious, the zeitgeist will then be suitable for the creation of the gecs, which will need the female vote for their creation. Masculists will push women to think that it is in women's self-interest to vote with men for the men-fairing of the gender laws, because in a men-fair society, men will be a lot more prepared to have relationships with women again, to be fathers again, and be prepared to help pay for the costs of raising kids, which is very much what women want. So the bottom line is, as shown in the very title of this flyer, and in the form of a pithy masculist slogan, quote, "You fluffies and feminists had better learn some masculism if you don't want to be manless." End quote. Summarizing, there's a chain of logic that follows from the general biconsciousing of women, and that is that with millions of biconscious women, we will see the fipping of women, which will allow the creation of the gecs, with women, biconscious women, voting with men for their creation. The gecs will then men-fair the gender laws, especially reforming the divorce courts, so that men are more prepared to be fathers again. The gecs will legislate the para and the optap, so that men no longer see relationships with women as toxic, especially marriage and paternity. With women pulling their financial weight equally with men and accepting equal obligations with men, the awful polarization and gender war that is increasingly growing between the sexes in today's world can be reversed. Masculisted men will see women less as, quote, monoconscious feminazi cunts, in quotes, and more as nice to be with, as partners for relationships and to have kids with. Sooner or later, the crash in the birth rate in brackets. For example, with both South Korea and Japan now both having birth rates of 0.7 kids per woman, which is a third of the replacement rate of 2.1 kids per woman, close brackets, must be reversed or we wipe ourselves out. So society has no choice but to make women nicer for men to be with. Or women will be seen as geociders, that is, wiping out the world's population, and hence truly hated. So it is in government's interest to push women to learn some masculism so that they become biconscious. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. In brackets, click on the Masculist tab for 690 plus masculist essays and their videos. Google the terms London Real and Hugo de Garis to see videos on masculism at, quote, AI will kill 1 billion people, dash, do we create our exterminators, question mark? Professor Hugo de Garis, dash, London Real, in brackets. See the last half hour of this 2-hour interview for the Masculist segment, as well as Countdown to Extinction, How AI Will Exterminate Mankind, again for the last 40 minutes on masculism. These flyers are available in text and video formats on Minds, BitChute, Odyssey, MGTOW.tv, X, and YouTube, in brackets, although well down in the search list since YouTube has shadow banned my masculist videos. I have nearly 1,000 masculist videos in 14 playlists on YouTube that can be accessed by searching for the channel name De Garis Masculist Videos. That's all one.